Hi, this is Brass Check, and we're recording this on the 1st of October, 2024. And I'm going to be discussing two incredible books, and I don't know why they're not all over the internet. Well, actually, I do know why, because seemingly nothing, hardly anything worthwhile makes it to the internet these days. Anyway, they're by a guy named James Barr. One is called A Line in the Sand, and the other is called Lords of the Desert. And when I start revealing some of the facts in these books, and by the way, written by an Oxford trained historian, not a conspiracy theorist, just established history that somehow has never made it to certainly the mainstream news media and hasn't yet made it to the $1 million podcasters. But before I go into these books, I want to follow up on something that I sent via email. It appears, just so you know, background, we stream our videos from YouTube. Why? Because it's the only way we can afford to do what we do. We can't afford to have our own media servers here and all the expense and hassle that would take. So for the last 19 years, we've streamed video from YouTube. Well, it appears that they are now starting to reshuffle the cards and in some instances block people from accessing YouTube videos that are on our website. You may have gotten a screen that tells you have to log in. Okay, that's not us. That's YouTube doing that. So far, it seems that all you have to do is refresh the page and that message goes away. But I don't know what the future is going to hold. There's really no reason why they should have ever let us use their servers for free. I don't know why they did. I'm glad they did, but they are able to pull that at any moment. And that is the game of Silicon Valley, bait and switch. AOL did it, Facebook did it. I'm sure YouTube's going to do it too, which is they give away all this great stuff. And as soon as they dominate the field and crush everybody else in the field, then they pull all the goodies away. And one of the great goodies of YouTube, frankly, has been our ability to stream directly from their servers. So anyway, bottom line, if you get a weird message covering one of our videos that's on our site, see, we never wanted to play the YouTube game. We always wanted to be independent on our own website, streaming from YouTube, but not on YouTube. It's a long story, but it's kept us independent. So anyway, if that screen comes up, just hit refresh, and 99 so far, 99 times out of 100, we've been able to get straight through and watch our video without having to register with YouTube. And I love their pretext. We're doing it to protect the community. 99,999 times out of 100,000, when a government or a corporation tells you they're doing it to protect you, you can count on they're doing it to screw you. So anyway, you know what to do. Hit the rewind button or the refresh button if you've been blocked by YouTube. You may not have experienced this yet, but if you do, now you're prepared. If you've already experienced it, this is the answer. Okay, now let's get on to the show. In an ideal world, I would spend anywhere from 40 to 50 hours making a beautifully polished program based around these two books. We don't live in an ideal world, and I'm a big believer in half a loaf is better than none. So I'm just going to go through them in a thoughtful way. I've read them. I've paid close attention to them, with what's on these pages, and I want to share what this guy is talking about. And why he's not all over the media right now is a mystery to me, but very often the people that really know what they're talking about are excluded from the media. His name is James Barr, B-A-R-R. He is an Oxford grad. He's been a visiting fellow at King's College London. Where else has he been? St. Anthony's College in Oxford. He's written for the Telegraph, done a lot of travel in the Middle East. He got his start writing books on the Middle East with a really good book that we're not going to talk about called Desert on Fire, which is about T.E. Lawrence. I'll give you the synopsis there. The British wanted to undo the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans controlled the Middle East, did for centuries. It was relatively peaceful. And during World War One, the Ottomans sided with the Germans. World War One now, not World War Two, World War One, and the British wanted to undo the Ottomans' hold in the Middle East so that they could take it over. So Lawrence of Arabia went and worked with various Arab groups to fight the Ottomans and drive them out on behalf of what turned out to be on behalf of the British. So that's the story of Lawrence of Arabia, Britain trying to take over the Middle East post World War I. So the first book, these books are unbelievable what they reveal. Let me give you an example. Two things, just off the top. The basic theme. One of the books is about France and England battling it out in the Middle East. And probably you've never heard that France and England battled it out in the Middle East. The other one's about the US and England battling it out in the Middle East. And I'm sure you've never heard of the US and England battling it out, the UK battling it out in the Middle East, but they most certainly have. Perhaps the most shocking fact that Barr reveals is, all countries, all organizations keep files of all their correspondence and reports and so on and so forth. And when it has to do with diplomatic relations and activities with other countries, they keep it confidential, or what do you call it, classified. So generally, after 30 years, documents of this nature are declassified. Okay. Now, check this out. The UK's papers related to its dealings with the United States occupy a bookshelf that is 100 meters long, right? That's a football field. So imagine a football field and a multi-level library bookshelf filled with documents, correspondence, special reports, secret reports, classified reports, 100 meters long. And guess what? What Barr found out, UK is not going to declassify what's in those papers. So that just gives you an overview of how much we don't know about what's really going on in the Middle East. Second thing, and this is pretty mind-boggling, guess who supported the Zionist terrorists pre-1948 with arms? Well, we knew the Zionist gangsters in the United States did, but the real support came from, drum roll please, France. That's right. France wanted to maintain its foothold in Syria and Lebanon, and they thought that would be best accomplished by driving the British out, because the British were trying to undermine the French in Lebanon and Syria. Did you know that? Have you heard that anywhere? Okay, and in order to accomplish this goal, the French armed the Zionist terrorists so that they could go and kill British military, police, and civil authorities in Palestine. I don't know about you, but I found that quite shocking. What else did I learn from this book? These are the highlights. So if you don't have a lot of time, you've heard the big stuff, but I'm going to go through some of the details here. Just unbelievable. We know from reporting that we've done a long time ago, or from reporting that we've done a long time ago, that France helped Israel develop the nuclear bombs. It's atomic weapons program. Why? Long story, but they did, and not a surprise, right? They've been arming the Zionist terrorists since pre-1948. But who else was helping? We also know that James Jesus Angleton's, we've gone over this a lot in our book, which I should show because it's a shame the whole world doesn't know about this book. We know that James Jesus Angleton, the head of counterintelligence for the CIA, was also helping the Israelis get the atomic bomb. Also, it turns out the British were too. So, did you know that? I didn't know that. How could we not know such basic facts about our history? So first, I'm going to talk about this book, The Line in the Sand. And as you can see, it's a library book, and that's why I want to talk about it. So I can't write down all the notes. I'm just going to talk it out. And if you're interested, you could hear it, right? So this is the Anglo-French struggle for the Middle East, 1914 and 1948. So UK and France were cutting each other's throats, continuously in the Middle East, not just in Palestine, but also in Syria and also in Lebanon. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? Huh? Never heard that before, I bet. I didn't. All right, so let's go. I'm just going to go. This is going to be rough. Okay. So here we go. The elected, this is just this is pretty random. This is the was the elected prime minister of Lebanon. And I better get my glasses out here. And I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly. Riyad Asul. He worked closely with the British to expel the French from the Levant, from Levant. Imagine that. Prime Minister of Lebanon working behind the scenes with the British to drive the French out. Why? Because the Lebanese wanted to be free, understood, right? So they went to their British friends to help drive the French out. So what did the French do? They retaliated by funding the Zionist terrorists to get the British out. Did you know this? I didn't know it. All right, so here's de Gaulle and um, Churchill, thank you, uh, marching in triumph in Paris. Okay, so what this caption is, so a major figure named Lord Moyne, who was trying to bring some kind of order and sensibility and fairness to the Middle East, was assassinated by Zionist terrorists in Cairo. This is British. It's not like some peace guy. This was a British official. All right. And guess what the French were doing after 1940, after the armistice? For the next 3 years, France provided a safe haven for Zionist terrorists operating against Britain. Let me read that again. In the 3 years following 1944, Paris provided a safe haven for Zionist terrorists operating against Britain. All right, what else is in this thing? Okay, here's the fellow they murdered. The Zionist terrorist murdered, Lord Moyne. All right, what was his story? Lord Moyne, the most fervent backer of Britain's greatest Syria plan to oust France from the Levant, okay, was murdered by the Stern Gang in November 1944, just as the plan appeared to be coming to fruition. So if you get this, the French and the British are both in the Middle East. Britain wants France out. France wants Britain out. So what did the French do? They collaborated with the Stern Gang, which was a terrorist Zionist group, to murder the guy on the British side that was working on developing a plan to, from a British point of view, to bring order to the situation. Did you ever hear that? All right, what else do we have here? Okay. This is just astonishing. And we're on, I'm going to give you pages now here so people that get these books can find this. So this is page 181. So there was a policy about amongst the Zionists called Havlaga, which was to just chill out, chill out. And Yitzhak Shamir said, oh, it's a disastrous policy. All right, so it crumbled, right, in 1938. April 12th, 2 British constables died in a brave but inept attempt to defuse a bomb that had been found on a train used by Arab workers at the oil terminal in Haifa. Okay. So the Zionist terrorists in 1938, not 48, not 58, 1938, put a bomb on a train, and it ended up killing 2 brave guys that tried to defuse it. British employees of the British government. And then some youths, they're called Jewish, but they really should be called Zionist terrorist youths. Every time you hear the word Jewish, you should just there are Jewish people who are fantastic, and many of them are the leaders of trying to stop the genocide in Lebanon now and in Gaza. So whenever you hear about it just Zionist terrorists, that's who's doing this. That they're Jewish is incidental. All right. So two Jewish youths were sentenced to death for shooting at an Arab bus. This is in 1938. Some kids, so they just took some rifles and just shot at a bus full of Arab people. And that's the kind of stuff that was going on there. And one of them was the first Zionist to be executed by the British in Palestine. Okay, then what followed that? Okay, follow this with me, please. This is incredible. And we're talking about 38 here. 1938, Israel didn't become a nation until 48. And here's what the Zionist terrorists were doing in Palestine 10 years before the partition. On July 6th, 2 bombs were thrown into the Haifa market, killing 21 Arabs and 6 Jews. See, the Zionist terrorists, as you're going to see later, they don't worry about killing Jews. It doesn't bother them at all. They did it at the King David Hotel. Didn't bother them in the least. All right, so let's go on with other things they did. A week later, July 15th, another bomb on David Street in Jerusalem killed 10 Arabs and wounded 30 more. Further carnage was averted when he says Jew, I'm going to call Zionist terrorist, was spotted leaving a basket containing a 15-pound bomb covered with vegetables, excuse me, which was timed to detonate at 8 o'clock in the morning, right when all the ladies are coming out to shop. Another bomb exploded in Haifa market on the 25th of July. It killed 53 Arabs and wounded 37. Terrorist bombing. Who brought terrorist bombing against civilians to the Middle East? The Zionist terrorists, and they were doing it in the 1930s. Have you ever heard this from anybody? I'm amazed. I'm going to probably say that so much you're going to get tired of hearing it. Another bombing in the Haifa market at the end of August killed 24 Arabs and wounded 35. So this is, again, 1938. 1938. All right, now let's go to page 184. And again, I'm doing this on the fly because there's no time. I got so many other things going on. Hopefully, somebody that does this for a living will pick these books up and give them their due. And I'm trying to make it as easy for those people as possible. All right, page 184. Oh, yeah. So Arab people weren't happy about this. You think you might be a little perturbed if terrorists were throwing bombs into your marketplaces on a regular basis? And so groups of Arabs formed themselves into self-defense groups. They were called gangs. And then the British Army decided that they had to go after them. And the British Army's first and primary task was to hunt down and destroy these armed gangs. This is on page 184. Now, follow this. This is Montgomery, who went on to become the famous general during World War II. They must be hunted relentlessly when engaged in battle. When engaged in battle with them, we must shoot to kill. Okay, so this is what the British did to the Arabs. Okay, the Zionist terrorists were murdering them and Arabs. They were murdering the British and they were murdering Arabs. But who did the British go after? Well, check this out. Over the next 3 months, and this is 1936, resistance was brutally stamped out. Now, over the longer haul, the most recent, and this is an Oxford-trained historian. He's not a pro-Palestinian. He's not an anti-Semite. He's just a Oxford historian. And the funny thing about England is they have straight historians that will tell the truth about everything, but good luck ever hearing from them. All right. So check this out. Between 19, the most recent estimate, according to James Barr in his book, A Line in the Sand, between 1936 and 1939, about 5,000 Arab men were killed and 10,000 more were wounded. By the end of the uprising, 10%, 10% of the entire adult male population, Arab population, had been killed, wounded, imprisoned, or sent into exile. Okay. So between 1936 and 1939, 10% of the adult male Palestinian Arab population had been killed or wounded, imprisoned, or sent into exile by the British government. Meanwhile, who's throwing the bombs in the produce markets? It's the Zionist terrorists. I mean, try to figure this out. All right. Now we're on page 253, and now we're looking at the French side of this. The French consul in Jerusalem, Guy du Chaliard, informed his boss, René Massigli, that he'd been contacted by two terrorist groups. And again, the author calls them Jewish. They were Zionists. They're not, this is not a Jewish operation. This is a Zionist operation. I can't say that enough. And who are these terrorist groups that contacted French diplomats? One was the Irgun and the other was the Stern Gang, straight up criminal terrorist thugs. That's me adding that point. They sent to the French their declaration of war against the British. And that as part of that declaration of war, they bombed custom and excise's offices in Jerusalem, Haifa, and Tel Aviv. That's what the Irgun did. Can you imagine that? Bombing a government office. And they did it in 3 different places. And then wrote to the French and said, we've just declared war against your enemy, the British. I thought British and France were supposed to be allies. Not to be outdone, the Stern Gang shot dead 2 policemen, mandate policemen in Haifa. And then the Zionist terrorists went on in their communication to the French to say the following, blaming the British for precipitating the crisis. It praised France's swift and energetic effort to arrest the Lebanese cabinet members who were agents of England. The French, there was a free election in Lebanon. The French didn't like the outcome. So they arrested the prime minister and other people and cabinet members who the Zionist terrorists declared to the French were agents of England. So here's the letter from the Zionists. The Zionist resistance movement and Free France has very clear common interests. Sooner or later, the French will recognize it. It's pretty bold to say to the French. When the British refused to allow the Free French, so this is unbelievable. So it's World War II, right? And the Vichy French, the Nazi French, took over Lebanon. So there was a Free French group, and they wanted to broadcast their propaganda into Syria. The British refused. They're supposed to be allies in the war, and Britain's getting in the way of the representatives of Free France to conduct psychological warfare in Syria. So what did the Haganah do? They said, hey, man, you can use our facilities to broadcast this propaganda. All right, now, this story, unbelievable. This is on 254. I cannot believe. We've all heard of the USS Liberty, right? I assume everybody's heard of that. We've all heard of, most people have heard of the Hotel David, right? 2 terrorist acts. In the first one, the Liberty, murder of U.S. servicemen. The bombing of the Hotel David, murder of employees of the British government, including Jewish people, which again, the Zionist terrorists never were bothered by. Read this. And again, this is from James. I'm going to read this to you. This is from James Barr, Oxford trained historian. These books were published by, because, publishing houses are really scaredy cats. Like, they don't want to publish anything they can't back up. Okay, this is published by Norton. All right. This is not some, guy publishing something out of his basement. This is unreal. This took place November 25th, 1940. In a dock that day, a large cruise ship named the Patria was preparing to set sail for Mauritius. Its passengers, I believe this was in Palestine. Its passengers were unwilling, however, for they were Jewish refugees from Germany who had attempted to claim asylum in Palestine. On arrival, so they had been detained by British authorities, who were determined to enforce the immigration restrictions of the 1939 White Paper, and argued that among the refugees there might be German agent provocateurs set on stirring ethnic conflagration in Palestine. So you have to realize there was another element here, which is the Germans, which, for them, it would be great to have, an Arab Zionist battle raging, because that would undermine Britain in Middle East. And of course, Germany was trying to take over the Middle East too. All right, so we've got this boat, the Patria. It's November 25th, 1940. It's in the port in Palestine. And the French and the English are saying, look, we have a law here, immigration law. We have a limit on how many people we're going to take, and we're not taking you. You can go to Mauritius, right? So they had a place to go. Now, here's where it gets unbelievable, and listen up. The Patria never left the port. On the morning of the 25th, as the last deportees were being pressed up the gangway, so they were being put on the boat to go out. You got to leave, guys. There was a resounding explosion aboard, and the ship rolled onto its side. Despite frantic efforts by the British to extract those trapped within, all 263 died. So get this straight. A ship arrived in Palestine with refugees. And this is 1940. And the British said, we have immigration laws. You can't come here, but you can go to Mauritius. They detained all the refugees, and they put them back on the boat. As soon as they were back on the boat, an explosion took place. The boat sunk, and 269 refugees, 263 refugees were killed. That bombing was done by the Zionist terrorists. They killed on November 25th, 1940, to prove a point. The Zionist terrorists in Palestine bombed a refugee ship and killed 263 Jewish refugees. This is on page 254 of the book, A Line in the Sand by James Barr. How on earth is this not common knowledge? It's insane that this isn't known. And there's more. It was immediately obvious that sabotage was likely. It was known that the Haganah opposed the British efforts in deporting Jewish refugees. Here, and he goes on. This is 255 now. We stood there with our mouths open, recalled one of them, Raymond Schmittlein, as Hakochen, who was a Frenchman. Well, I'm not sure who Hakochen. I'm sorry. Again, half a loaf's better than none. You can get the book. You now know more than 99.999% of the population. But anyway, whoever this guy Hakochen was, Hakohen, he admitted that the cause of the blast that killed 263 Jewish refugees was a mine that the Haganah, the Zionist terrorist organization, had smuggled aboard to cripple the vessel so that it could not depart. This guy, Hakochen, who I guess was part of it, then asked them whether they thought modern Jews lacked Samson's courage. You know, the Samson doctrine, which is, we will kill you and everybody to get our way. And in this case, this was a point of pride by the Zionist terrorists, that they murdered 263 Jewish refugees to prove a point. This was a point of pride among these people. And again, Oxford Historian, published by W.H. Norton and Company. The book is A Line in the Sand, The Anglo-French Struggle for the Middle East, 1914 to 1948. How is this not known and talked about every day of the week? All right, let's go to page 259. Oh, well, this is a small thing, but Yitzhak Shamir we badly needed financial resources to buy up bases, to buy arms, to pay for our broadcasts and pamphlets, to keep ourselves alive. So the only option, according to them, was robbery. And they broke into people's houses, they robbed banks. And then they appealed to the French. The Zionist terrorists appealed to the French. It was hoped that the French, having been so recently humiliated by the British in Lebanon, we talked about that a little bit earlier. The English wanted the French out. The French obviously wanted to stay in, and the English helped undermine the French. And then, there are battles within battles within battles, and Europe has been up to its neck in blood, creating all this havoc as they fight their little games among each other. And then the Stern Gang laid out what they plan to do. Our approach is simple. It is to work clandestinely in an occupied country, an underground war where invisible, elusive soldiers undermine the immense imperial machine. And that's what they were saying to their friends and supporters, the French. Because again, the French were trying to undermine the British in the Middle East, as the British was trying to undermine them. All right, so having grown increasingly confident, the Stern Gang, which is one of the Zionist terrorist groups, now attempted its most audacious coup so far. On August 8th, it tried to murder the outgoing High Commissioner of Palestine, Sir Harold McMichael, and his wife on his farewell party given by some Arabs on the coast. All right, so he's done. He's on his way home. The invitation was public knowledge, as Macmillan's willingness to accept it had been criticized in a right-wing, I'm going to call it Zionist terrorist newspaper the day before. And the gang had time to plan an ambush. So this guy's on his way out. He's going back home. There's no reason to mess with him. His Arab friends put on a farewell party to him. The Zionist terrorists didn't like it. This is a high official of the British government. So they decide to assassinate him. Gang members set their trap at the point where the road from Jerusalem began its serpentine descent from the hills onto the coastal plain. On a wide bend, they shot up the High Commissioner's motorcycle outriders, who were in front. I assume they were killed, and the police car bringing up the rear. By simultaneously setting fire to a slick of oil across the road, they brought the McMichael's old Rolls Royce to a standstill at a point where there was seemingly nowhere to hide. To the right was a precipice, to the left a cliff. It was Macmillan's driver who saved their lives. He rammed into the car from the left side of the road, where it was better protected from the bullets coming from above by a slight overhang in the cliff and hard to push over the precipice to the right. I'm not following that. If you are, God bless you, you can read about it on 261. They had a very narrow escape. What was the fine against the people that did this? 500 pounds. That's what the British government did. They let one of its own people almost get murdered with his wife, who had done nothing wrong, was on his way out. And the British reacted lethargically to the attack on their chief representative in Palestine. This wasn't like some third level bureaucrat. This was the man. This was their guy in Palestine. And they let his car get shot up and have him and his wife almost murdered. And then said, well, we're going to impose a 500-pound fine on the nearest settlement. And they never collected the money. No sanctions were imposed on the wider Zionist community, even though the Jewish agency's condemnation of the ambush was mealy mouthed. Now we know who did the ambush, right? Would the Arabs who had just invited him to a party to celebrate his time in Palestine go after him? No, this was and this is again James Barr, Oxford trained historian. He's been to Oxford as a visiting fellow. W.H. Norton, big publishing company. This can't be some crazed thing. This is as close to history as we're going to get. Pretty amazing, huh? What was going on over there? All right. There was a lot of negotiating, a lot of backroom stuff going on around the UN General Assembly. They didn't have their big headquarters on the East 40s. They were still out in Flushing Meadow. The partition was not the idea of partitioning Palestine and cutting it up into two, religious based countries was not popular among UN members. But as he says, it was the home game. It was a home game for the Zionist delegation, which organized crowds of local supporters to demonstrate outside the building and lobbied brilliantly within. The organization and arguments contrasted strikingly with the disunited representatives of the Palestine Arabs and the surrounding Arab states, who, in the words of one disappointed British official, were rather second-rate. And that is unfortunately a problem. The Zionists and their allies they're heavy-handed, but they are superb propagandists, and they're well organized. And unfortunately, the other side, not so. So that was on page 338. Yeah, and again, half a loaf is better than none. The option is you never hear about these books and nobody ever tells you about them. And what you're getting instead is a guy sort of fumbling his way through them, but at least you're getting some stuff, right? And there was obviously going to be a problem because we had some highly aggressive Zionist terrorists who, as I pointed out, this is again a piece of history, not debatable. We've covered it before. Where were these guys trained? Well, Mussolini loved the Zionist terrorists, and they loved him. And he admitted 100 or more of their members in the 1930s to his Naval Academy. That's where they would have learned all this stuff. It's one of the places they would have learned it all. Okay, so now this is page 346. This is running up to the partition. The previous December, the United States had declared it was imposing an embargo on arms shipments to the Middle East and had pressed its allies to do likewise. So this is very interesting. And I believe this was either Roosevelt or Truman. There was sanity in this country back then, pockets of it in the government. And they didn't see any value into having the Middle East go up in flames as opposed to the psychos that are running things now. And to try to keep things calm, I think it was Truman. They said, look, yeah, it was Truman. No weapons. We're not sending any weapons. And of course, the Zionist gangs in Zionist supporting gangs in the United States under Meyer Lansky, they sent all kinds of weapons illegally, but that's another story. Parts of the French government tried to cooperate. On the 5th of March, 1948, French officials had seized a supply of arms near Marseille, which is a port right in the Mediterranean, and arrested its couriers, who were members of the Irgun. Until that point, so right up until 48, until that point, the Irgun manufactured its weapons with the machinery in a zipper factory. I mean, you have to admire their resourcefulness. Their morals are subhuman. But they were resourceful. They needed better arms. In hope of persuading the French government to release the consignment, and its couriers. A representative of the Irgun went to see France's special envoy in Palestine, having reminded him that the British were helping to arm Abdullah, whoever that was. He warned that the fact that the French police, which for a long time was not aware of our activities, chose at this time of the ordeal to arrest our friends and can only be seen by the Irgun as a sign of hostility. We would be deeply sorry to have to conclude that French is abandoning its traditional policy of supporting oppressed people. So here the Zionist terrorists are trying to arm themselves. The French are listening to the U.S. and saying no more arms for Palestine and the Middle East and the Middle East in general. And the French cooperate, and the Irgun representative is crying justice. And the French guy they spoke to said the Irgun is a force of crucial importance now in Palestine. It's a fact that it would be better not to have them as opponents. So France had to worry about having these Zionist terrorists as opponents. And in fact, its activity, the Irgun, until now has sometimes been indirectly favorable to French interests. Well, as we pointed out earlier, France was actually arming the Zionist terrorists. One of the advisors in France wrote a memorandum arguing that France should back the group, back the Zionist terrorists, which he described as not just a handful of terrorists or guerrillas, but very disciplined troops, well-trained and well-commanded to fight and win. Okay, so I guess if you're well-trained and well-commanded, then you're not a terrorist anymore, even if you're killing civilians left and right and throwing bombs into markets. Power politics, guys. That's how it works. You know, the British never listened to anything the Irish had to say until Michael Collins, the leader of the resistance in Ireland, succeeded in assassinating, I don't know, it was like half a dozen British agents, all at the same time. It wasn't just here and there random. And after he did it, his comment was, I wanted to show the British that the Irish can tell time too. And after that, then the British started respecting the Irish and started negotiating with them. So this appears to be how the world works. And because the Zionist terrorists were such efficient killers, the French thought that, gee, maybe we should take them more seriously. The French authorities should be encouraged to, quote, turn a blind eye to the arms purchases that the Zionist terrorists, my words, were secretly making in France, or to the transit of war equipment across French territory in defiance of the American-led embargo. Now, there was a secret deal made. France would supply 153 million. This is post-war France, on its knees, people still homeless, starving, the country still in ruins. Guess what? France had 153 million francs worth of weaponry. Why? They wanted to influence the newly independent Jewish state. Why? Because they wanted to piss off their allies, the British. Has anybody ever told you about this? I got to ask this question again. So obviously the Palestinians have been pawns of some kind of psycho European power game that's been going on a long, long time. And one of the pieces on the board has been the Zionist terrorists who France supported in its assassination, murder, and terrorist acts against individuals and against infrastructure in Palestine. Wow. Wow. I mean, is it just me, or is this kind of off the hook stuff? The arms were delivered to a port in France, which I cannot pronounce, in early June, and shipped to Tel Aviv aboard a landing craft that the Irgun had purchased. Okay, and from that point on, France would be Israel's leading arms supplier until 1956. How do you like that? All right, that was on page 347. Okay, let's go to page 358. Okay, so remember, this all started when Britain sponsored the Zionists in the early part of the 20th century, because they thought, hey, they're kind of like us. We can work with them. They can be our beachhead against the Arabs. Right? So Britain's sponsorship of I'll call them Zionist terrorists in Palestine, And France's favoritism of the Christians in Lebanon were policies designed to strengthen their respective positions in the region by eliciting gratitude from both minorities. Okay, so the French were backing the Christians, and the UK was backing the Zionists. Out of a sense of justice and decency? No. Out of a way to have a foothold in the region. The appreciation they generated by doing so was short-lived. Yeah, no shit. But they did succeed, as all governments do, in fucking things up royally. They deeply antagonized the predominantly Muslim Arab population of both countries and the wider region with irreversible effects. As Britain and France became increasingly unpopular, they were forced into oscillating alliances that only continued to polarize Arab and Jew, Christian and Muslim further. The mandatories, British mandate, abrupt change of policy under pressure, and their refusal to institute meaningful representative government made it clear to those they ruled that violence worked. So who taught the Middle East? I mean, no place is perfect, and there's always chicanery going on, and there are, you know, there are psycho ambitious people trying to steal everything that's not nailed down. But who brought the savagery and the violence to the Middle East? Okay. Well, we know the Zionist terrorists did, but it was also the British and the French. All right, until the Second World War, the British reluctantly accepted the presence of the French as what their ambassador to Cairo, Lord Killearn, termed an unnecessary evil which we must make the best of. So up until World War II, they didn't like each other. They were jockeying for position, but, it was more or less straight. While a further war with Germany looked possible then likely and then inevitable, Britain's relations with metropolitan France, that's Paris, were more important than what was going on in the Middle East. The plain fact was the presence of the French in the Levant was a perpetual irritant that upset British policy in the Middle East. But I have always realized that we ought to conform and adapt our local policy to the needs of our higher interests in regard to metropolitan France, which is our neighbor just across the channel. Now, then came the war. The collapse of France in 1940 destroyed the assumptions on which that policy was based, that France would be a vital ally in any fight with Germany. The vacuum gave, so remember the Germans came in, they took over France, they installed the Vichy government, which was basically a Nazi government run by French people. And by the way, do you run a government? Something to think about. Do you run a government with 5 guys and a pickup truck? It takes thousands of people to run a government. There were thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of Nazi collaborators in the French government during World War II. And when the war ended, they just melted away into the background. Anyway, the loss of Free France, the vacuum gave British officials the opportunity. They saw it as an opportunity. Their allies overrun by Germany, and Britain saw it as an opportunity. This is how these people think. It gave the British officials the opportunity to press for the independence of Syria and Lebanon, to provide Arabs with representative government that they themselves were unwilling to provide, to supply in Palestine. So what did the British do? So the Germans overrun France. And so what did the British do? They go and they agitate in Lebanon and Syria to get the local population to throw off the French occupiers, right? And have a representative democratic government, right? Something they were not willing to give the Palestinians themselves, because the British were running Palestine. Complicated, right? But it's not. But at the end of the day, it's not. The effort at distraction briefly worked, but ultimately its consequences made it self-defeating. No shit. As onlookers immediately recognized Lebanese and Syrian independence set a precedent in the countries immediately to the south, and it was not long before the British were ousted too by the Zionist terrorists. So here's the last paragraph. The wrangling between the British and the Free French throughout the war years had a further far-reaching consequence when de Gaulle returned to power in 1958. As president of France, he infamously vetoed Harold Macmillan's application to join the common market. That's the EU. Who knew, right? In tracing exactly why de Gaulle said no, it is, surprisingly, to the hot and noisy cities of Beirut and Damascus that we should look. The general's experience of British machinations in both places profoundly shaped his reluctance to allow his wartime rivals to join his European club. It is a tale from which neither country emerges with much credit. So while they were theoretically allies fighting the Germans, the Free French and the UK government and the French government were battling it out in the Middle East. Britain trying to undermine France's hold over Lebanon and Syria, and France, in retaliation, in a tit for tat, was undermining British control of Palestine. And how now? Here's the big punchline. How did the French work to undermine the British in Palestine? They armed the Zionist terrorists, who as early as the 1930s were already doing terror bombings in public places, targeting civilians. And as we pointed out in this book, one of their operations included the bombing of a ship full of Jewish refugees, which was done by the Zionist terrorists. Now, there was another bombing of a ship. Well, it's in the book. It's in the book. That wasn't the only ship they bombed. That wasn't the only ship the Zionist terrorists bombed. Killing Jewish refugees. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from this book. A Line in the Sand by James Barr. Again, Oxford-trained historian. He was good enough that they invited him to come back and be a fellow. Norton, W.W. Norton, published the book, so it can't be too crazy. And these are basic facts of history that explain a lot of what's going on. I mean, if the French hadn't armed the Zionist terrorists and supported them in the 30s, or in that period, we might have had a very different world. All right, now the next book. Remember, I started out and I said that the British, like all governments, keep files, all correspondence, telegrams, cables, intelligence reports, activity reports, action reports. The British file that relates to their relationship with the United States is 100. The bookcase with all the files, you got to visualize this, man, is 100 meters long. And unlike the French doc, what James Barr found out, he was able to get the French story. British were willing to give that up. He could not. He did not have similar luck when he tried to find out how the Americans and the British were trying to cut each other's throats. Yeah, it wasn't just the French and British. The Americans and the British were trying to cut each other's throats too. So the book is called Lords of the Desert, James Barr, The Battle Between the United States and Great Britain for Supremacy in the Modern Middle East. Did you know that? Did you know they were fighting each other tooth and claw? All right, so I'm going to go through this thing in my similar low-tech way. We're on page 43. By 1943, the British had enough intelligence to convince them that the Zionists were going to use force to get what they wanted. Ben-Gurion's Jewish Agency, all these people were sending money to help Jewish refugees, and Ben-Gurion was stealing 15% of it for internal security, to keep everybody safe, which they believed meant arming the Haganah, an 80,000 strong illegal paramilitary organization, partly with weaponry it was buying from the French in Syria, partly through well-organized, large-scale theft from British forces in Palestine. So that's how they got armed. And he doesn't mention, for some reason, the American gangsters led by Meyer Lansky. The mobs, the guy that put organized and organized crime, the financier, the banker for the heroin trade, and for all criminal activity. You got to do something with that money. You need a banker. And the guys that ran the different families, weren't that good at it. So Meyer Lansky took care of it. He also ran Murder Incorporated, which was basically an assassination squad. Anyway, in 1 month alone, 600 rifles, 20 machine guns, ammunition, and 3 tons of explosives, which they used, we know that, disappeared from British depots in the Mandate. A informer enabled the British to eavesdrop on a meeting at which the head of the Haganah spoke. We all know that the Zionist problem will have to be solved one day by force of arms. It can never be solved by political argument, only by fight. That was their attitude then. That's their attitude now. They're gangsters, and they're going to use violence to get what they want. Okay. So that's on page 43, sort of a recap. Now, this is really interesting. I'm not a fan of Saudi Arabia, but there was a guy named Ibn Saud. And in 1943, he was interviewed by Life magazine. This is the head of Saudi Arabia. And he dismissed the idea that Zionists had a claim to Palestine. And he called on a ban on land sales. He said, look, if the Jews are imperiled to seek a place to live, Europe and America, as well as other lands, are larger, true, and more fertile, true, than Palestine, and more suitable to their welfare and interests, true. And believe me, millions of Jews agree. That's why they're in New York, LA, London, and all kinds of other places. They don't want to be in Palestine. Are you kidding me? Or in Israel? What are you, nuts? Why do we do that? So even though I'm not a fan of the royal family of Saudi Arabia, the guy was making sense, and he wasn't being mean. He wasn't saying, let them die. He wasn't saying, I hate the Jews. He was saying, you know what? I don't think they really should be coming here. I think there are better places for them to go to. Now we know why were they coming? Because they were encouraged by the British, because the British initially thought, oh, these are our guys. We'll be able to use them as a stick against the Arabs. Yeah, that backfired pretty good. Thank you very much, UK. Now, here's an interesting thing. Did you know that Churchill was a Zionist? I didn't know. This is on page 50. He's a straight up Zionist, not a supporter of Israel or a supporter of this. He was a Zionist. And he became one in 1921. And he wasn't into the restrictions. This is on page 50, I think I already said that. He wanted unlimited immigration to Palestine. What else? Our only chance of projecting our influence post-war is through the economic side. Because again, they were already, during the war, they were already jockeying against the Americans. Now, remember, we're talking about the American side now. During the World War II, Great Britain, UK, and the US were already jockeying for who was going to control the Middle East after World War II. Of course, Truman landed in this. He signed off on a letter drafted by the State Department that struck to Roosevelt's, quote, no decision without full consultation script. But this ran counter to the pro-Zionist manifesto that he and Roosevelt had stood on, and he soon decided it was not tenable. The end of the war in Europe in May that year finally made the scale of the refugee crisis apparent. An estimated 250,000 displaced people, which seems like a low number to me, needed to be found a home. Of that 250,000, 138,000 of them were Jewish, and the Zionists were adamant that their home should be Palestine. Now, their home could have been in Europe. There's no reason they had to leave Europe. A lot of people went through hell in World War II. And a lot of people went back home. They could have gone to the United States. They could have gone to Brazil. They could have gone to Argentina. There's all kinds of places they could have gone. But the Zionists wanted them to go to Palestine. And they were getting a lot of Truman was getting a lot of pressure, political pressure, because he had a big election that was going on in New York. One of the people running for Congress, and it was being made clear to him, you know, at that time there were 4 times as many Jewish people in New York than in the entirety of Palestine, and they were pressing hard for what they thought was a good thing, which was to allow unlimited immigration to Palestine and carve up the land and give a big chunk of it to the Zionists. This is on page 81. All right. 121. This is really interesting. Although FDR came from a family of Anglophiles, his own experience of working with the British in the war had left him jaded. Remember, this is the book about U.S.-British relations in the Middle East during and after the war. Recalling, quote, times when British representatives on the spot were, in defiance of London's instructions, doing all in their power to knife their American opposite numbers, and Americans on the scene whose every act was inspired by a desire to do the British in. This is during the war when we're allies. And this is the kind of stuff that was going on in the Middle East between the British and the United States. He came to the conclusion, says FDR, that Americans and British in the Middle East get along rather badly. End of quote. Now, here's the key. Probably I could have just done a minute and it would explain everything. FDR later explained, any power that has hoped to extend its domination over continents has learned that the domination of the Middle East is an essential step. Let me break that down. So you're a power. You're not happy just to be prosperous and take care of your own people at home. That's not enough. You want domination, not over your neighbors, just your neighbors. You want domination over entire continents, right? You won't settle for anything less. That's the British before World War I, and it's us now. Any power that has hoped to extend its domination over continents has learned that domination of the Middle East is an essential step. And any power trying to resist continental expansion by another has learned in turn that the Middle East must be protected at all costs. Let me read that again. This kind of sums up the whole story. And this is from FDR. Any power that wants to resist continental expansion by another power has learned that the Middle East must be protected at all costs. So if you're looking at the planet as a chessboard or some kind of game board, you must control the Middle East. That was important even before oil was discovered there, because it's just the ultimate trade route. Remember, England ruled India, right? England extracted, I saw a study on this, trillions of dollars in current money, trillions, not billions, trillions of dollars of wealth through its, battering and manipulation and brutalization of India. India was before the British came, India was one of the richest countries in the world. When British were done with it, it was one of the most disastrous countries in the world. How do you get to India from England? You got to go through the Middle East. So if you're a gangster and all your money is coming from the east side and you're on the west side, you better control Center City so you can get from the west side to the east side to keep stealing from the people in India. That's just one example of what Roosevelt's talking about. But if you're playing a game with the world, you've got to control the Middle East. That was on page 121 for people that want to get the book and read it. All right. It wasn't clear that there was that much oil in the Middle East until after World War II. Now they knew there was oil in Iran. They knew that for sure, and they knew there was oil in Iraq, and that's why Britain was so keen on brutalizing Iraq way back. That's one of their first experiments with aerial bombardment of civilians took place during World War I. Yes, it did, in Iraq. Yeah, anyone ever told you that? There was a time when we didn't drop bombs on civilians from planes. That wasn't the original idea of flying, right? And bit by bit, the psychopaths who run things made that a thing. Now, who do they experiment with? Ethiopians, Moroccans, and Iraqis, because it was an unthinkable savagery to do it to people perceived as human beings, but it was okay to do it to tribesmen. And I have a book here on that whole subject. And basically the idea was, hey, we could fight it out with them, or we could just bomb their villages in the mountains. See how they like that. Yeah. So anyway, there's a lot of oil in Saudi Arabia that wasn't. They didn't know it was there until after the war. And the British say this guy spoke at the this is on page 136 at the Royal Geographical Society. He provided a detailed description of the Liwa, which was I guess an area with a lot of oil, which had, quote, never yet been seen by a European. You got to remember, Saudi Arabia, this 40s, man, people weren't getting around as easily as they get around today. And so there were whole sections of the Saudi Arabia that as this guy said, had not been seen by a European. Like it was someplace that the Europeans never made it to. And coincidentally, there happened to be a whole bunch of oil there. They'd seen oil in 1949. He ventured south into the Amani hinterland, where previously he had seen signs of oil and where tribes displayed pro-Saudi proclivities. At some point before embarking on the trip, he received some training from the oil companies on what to look for. So this was a guy from the Iraq Petroleum Company. And they gave this explorer, this anthropologist, some money to sort of snoop around in this otherwise never accessed part of Saudi Arabia. And the oil people trained him. Here's what to look for. It was on this journey that the guy's name was Thesiger. This is on page 137, spotted two hills named Salak and Madhamar. And his next article mentioned them both in passing, but it was only in a book much later that he stated their significance. Quote, both of them were dome-shaped, and I thought regretfully that their formation was the sort of geologists associate with oil. He was covering his tracks. Anyway, he helped bring the British, or he helped bring oil exploration to Saudi Arabia. And I guess he had mixed feelings about doing that because he knew what it was going to do to the society. All right, now we're on page 175. Now this was interesting. Remember the Canal Zone crisis? So the French and the English got together and built the Suez Canal. Essential to domination of the planet. They both had a stake in it. India wanted, India for England and Southeast Asia for France. And then the Egyptians said, "Great, thanks for building it, and I think we'll take it. It's on our country. It's on our property. We're gonna just take it." And the first people that went in to fight the Egyptians were the Zionists, and then the French and the British followed after that. And when Churchill raised now this is where the Americans and British are battling. When Churchill raised his hope that the Americans might commit troops to Suez and stand shoulder to shoulder against Mossadegh, I guess that was in Iran, Truman delegated the matter to Dean Acheson and Eden to discuss. The president was quite abrupt with poor old Winston, one of the British team wrote afterward. It was impossible not to not to be conscious that we were playing second fiddle. The talks went nowhere. Churchill again appealed to the Americans to send troops to the Canal Zone to help, telling Congress it had become an international rather than a national responsibility. But Truman and Atchison were determined to keep their distance. Quote, Atchison said, "We would be like two people locked in a loving embrace in a rowboat which is about to go over Niagara Falls," the Secretary of State said. He, quote, thought we should break the embrace and take to the oars. With that analogy, Atchison got a laugh out of Churchill, but nothing more. He wanted the British to recognize Farouk as king of Sudan, believing that this would break the deadlock over the Middle East command talks, but Eden refused. Anyway, it goes on and on, just the convoluted stuff that was going on. But basically, the Americans left the British high and dry when it came to the Suez crisis. They did not go in. They did not send troops. Because what did we care? Egypt operates it. Great Britain operates it. Just make sure we can get our ships through. We don't care who owns it. Britain, if you want to fight, good luck. We're not going to help. The French were, and now here we go. The French were not simply planning to stand back, because they had a stake in that canal too. They owned part of it. One of the guys asked the other guy to stop taking notes and outline the plan that they were thinking of. They would encourage the Israelis to attack Egypt, at which point the Britain and France would order both sides to draw back from the canal, and they'd send in troops to, quote, separate the combatants and take charge of the waterway. This is on page 278. So here's the deal. France and Britain built the Suez Canal in the 19th century. They felt they owned it. In the whenever it was, 56, the people of Egypt thought differently. They said, it's on our land. I guess it's ours. And they appropriated it. So how did that get handled? This is really interesting, and I've never heard this anywhere else before. Page 278 of the book we're talking about, Lords of the Desert by James Barr. They set it up as follows. Hey, Israelis, buddies. French said, remember we armed you to help drive the British out? How about we do the following? You go to Egypt, not us, and you bump heads with the Egyptians. And then we'll come in as the heroes, da, 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 and we will separate the combatants and take the canal back. That's Israel's role. You have all these people like Bobby Kennedy, I'm sorry to say, Israel's our aircraft carrier, and in the Middle East. Well, the Zionist extremists are absolutely a puppet. But puppet can bite you too, right? If you have a mad dog that you set on people, maybe that mad dog's going to take a bite out of you someday, which is, of course, what happened. All right, that was page 278. If the Israelis, this is 279, rather than the British, attacked Nasser in the final moments of the American presidential campaign, would Eisenhower dare object, given the power of the Zionist lobby? Macmillan, who had just visited Washington, thought not. That's why they wanted to use the Israelis as the mad dog to go after the Egyptians. And the French, this is on 281, the French offered to base French fighters in Israel to guard the Israeli coast. And then Ben-Gurion, thus reassured, agreed to launch an attack on a scale that would give London. So they said, look, here, Israel, you attack them. And I know you're worried that, someone's going to come up behind you because you just sent your troops west to Egypt. We'll put our troops in Israel to protect you. Okay, you attack them. And they did it on such a scale that would give London and Paris grounds to intervene 36 hours later. And that's what they did. Britain had this big hold over oil in Iraq and also oil in Iran. And then when Mossadegh, who was the head of Iran, nationalized the oil, um, they also, that company, Anglo-Iranian, also owned half of the Kuwaiti National Oil Company. So Britain changed its focus from Iran to Kuwait, and it then became the most important country in the Middle East because that's where Britain was getting its oil. And this is really interesting too. And this is already back in the 40s. This was already in play. Equally as important as the oil that Britain was getting from Kuwait, the ruler of Kuwait, whose income was estimated at £1.25 million a week, which was a lot of money back then, had become the single biggest investor in the City of London. And City of London is like Wall Street. It's Britain's Wall Street. When you hear City of London, you're really saying Britain's Wall Street. So imagine this. This little blip in the Middle East was not only England's kind of like last, they just lost Iran, the Iranian oil, or cheap access to the Iranian oil. Now they had to pay for it. So they were very concerned with the Kuwaiti oil, which they depended on. But as important was the fact that the guy that ruled Kuwait was generating so much money in oil revenue in 46 post-war, and the Kuwaiti oil had been discovered long before, that he was the single biggest investor on the UK's Wall Street. Did you know that? Did you know that how intertwined all these relationships are? All right, that was on page 3322. Now, amazingly, and we did this book, which I want to show you. Well, this one, of course. Well, Kennedy was working, we were talking about how Kennedy was on the Israelis saying, no nuclear weapons. If you develop nuclear weapons, you're going to have a problem with us. You're certainly not going to get support from us. That was the summer of 1963. Well, in the fall of 1963, there was even more chicanery going on, but this had to do with the Brits. Okay. And this is convoluted too, and you've never heard of it. I never heard of it. It's on page 370. The Brits were trying to run some kind of operation in Yemen, which is so important right now, against the Egyptians, who were also trying to run an operation in Yemen. And Kennedy got involved because he was, after all, the president of the United States, the most powerful country in the world, who had an interest in the Middle East. And he asked the British representative, seeing the Yemen operation as a way to fight the pressures that would ultimately force British withdrawal from Aden, he was willing to trade on his straight reputation to protect it. This is a British guy, Alec Douglas Home. And Kennedy asked him straight up, he's a British representative, are you arming these Yemen rebels? We're giving them nothing, he said to Kennedy. He lied. I'm sorry, I got it wrong. He was supporting the royalists in Yemen. The British were. He lied when Kennedy directly asked him if Britain was supporting the royalists in Yemen. We are confident that the UK and the Saudi Arabian government are not supporting the royalists. They promised not to, and they're not. Kennedy continued taking them at their word. Kennedy later found out that that wasn't true, and he was pissed. And he called England. He called Douglas Home and accused him straight up of lying. He said, our CIA knows that you are supporting the royalists. And Douglas Home replied that he would make inquiries and promised to get back to him 2 days later on November 22nd, 1963. So while all this other, that's of course the day Kennedy was assassinated. So while all this other stuff was going on, Kennedy, everybody knows Kennedy signed a document that was working to extricate the United States from Vietnam. Kennedy had the beginning of a sequence of events that he hoped, and Khrushchev, I believe, hoped would lead to the de-arming, the denuclearization of the world. All that stuff was going on. We now know, thanks to this book, which everybody I hope will get and support, Talk It Up, that he and this Attorney General were fighting Israel on the nuclear weapons issue and on the fact that the Israelis were violating foreign lobbying laws. But while all that was going on, there was this battle over Yemen. Egypt was on one side and the UK was on the other. And Kennedy wanted it to be, well, what did Kennedy want? I'm not sure what Kennedy wanted, but he felt it had something to do with the U.S. prestige, and he just wanted it handled. And the British just straight up lied to him, and the Israelis were involved too in Yemen. By now, the Israelis were doing everything they could to increase the Egyptian casualty rate because the Egyptians were down there fighting too. Since 1956, when Yemen would not deal with the Israelis directly, relations between Israel and Britain improved considerably. Britain liked the idea that Israel and Yemen were at odds with each other. The thaw was undoubtedly helped by Britain's okay, this is the big one. 270. I mean, look, this is like a 400-page book, you know. On page 371, the thaw between Israel and Britain. Remember, there's big kind of bad feeling, right? UK was running Palestine. The Zionist terrorists who became the leaders of the Free Democratic Israel were murdering British officials left and right, policemen, bombing markets, bombing trains, bombing hotels, bombing the British headquarters in Palestine, right? So there's some bad blood between the British and the wacko Zionists. But there was a thaw. And because Britain kind of said, well, we kind of need these guys now. And they've got Israel, so we got to deal with them. The thaw, and you know, there are a lot of families in Britain who had family members murdered by the Zionist terrorists, right? Police officers that were down there in Palestine, and soldiers, bureaucrats, you know, people just down there working, you know, people working in the offices. But somehow that's all, you know, I guess that's not an issue in Great Britain. Anyway, this thaw between the Zionist crazies in Israel and UK was undoubtedly helped by Britain's surreptitious sale of heavy water to the Israelis in 1958. This is page 371 of the book, Lords of the Desert. An ingredient which would help them build a nuclear bomb. That in turn led the United States to supply conventional weapons to Tel Aviv in an attempt to ensure they did not use it. Unbelievable. So John F. Kennedy, our president, was telling the Israelis, do not develop a nuclear weapons program. We want to inspect your research facility. It's called Dimona. We want to inspect that facility twice a year, and we want everything wide open, and we want to look at everything, just the way we inspected Iraq, just the way we demand to inspect Iran. We want to do the same with Israel. Why? We didn't want a proliferation of nuclear weapons. Kennedy did not want the proliferation of nuclear weapons. He was fighting nuclear weapons. So what did our allies, excuse me, do? And that's the theme of this book, Lords of the Desert, the battle between the US and the UK in the Middle East, which heated up after World War II. It started during World War II because they were already jockeying, and then it continued. Now, why is heavy water important? I think you know. It's an ingredient that would help them build a nuclear bomb. So not only did France provide Israel with technology for nuclear weapons, not only did the U.S. CIA, in the form of the director of counterintelligence, help the Israelis get the atom bomb against the wishes of his president. Britain felt they needed to get involved too. Have you ever heard these things before? Somehow the Israelis just somehow magically got an atomic weapons program. And this was all done over John Kennedy's dead body, essentially. So the Brits the wanted to drop some weapons into Yemen. They couldn't do it themselves because even though they were, engaged in maximum chicanery against the United States, they didn't want to, do it up front. So who did they call on? They called on the same people the French called on when they wanted to get the British out of Palestine. They called on the same people that the French and English called on, or the French called on, when they wanted to create a pretext for Britain and France to send armies to Egypt. They called on their good friends, the Zionist terrorists. So the Israelis were the ones that delivered the weapons to Yemen on behalf of the British. The Israelis had muffled the engines, and it was very quiet. The huge aircraft came in for the actual drop, and as it passed, 60 parachutes spewed out the back. It was really excellent dropping, really professional stuff. Abdullah bin Hassan, I guess was the head of the faction that the British were supporting, was delighted. Cooper, whoever that was deeply impressed. Now check this out. This is 64. Kennedy's already dead. The source of these weapons was brilliantly conceived. Every serial number had been scored out. The parachutes were of Italian origin, and even the wood shavings used in the packing had been imported from Cyprus. Even the most expert intelligence analysts would have had a job to unravel that one. Well, on page 372, all these years later, James Barr, author of Lords of the Desert, tells us who did the airlift to help destabilize Yemen. And that was our friends, the Israeli terrorists. And then here's a really interesting thing. Kennedy's successor as president, Lyndon Johnson, this is on page 374, having decided to escalate American involvement in Vietnam, was pleased to have the British share some of the international opprobrium, if that's how you pronounce it, he might have otherwise faced alone. In other words, he wanted the British to be out there doing dirty deeds too. So that, you can only count so many, as the Israelis, as the Zionist terrorists in Israel who run the country have demonstrated brilliantly, you can only hold so many atrocities in your head at one time. And then people just get numb. So Johnson thought, I like this. I like Britain causing mayhem in the Middle East, because then, half the newspaper instead of all the newspaper will talk about our atrocities in Vietnam. So anyway, these books are out there. They're by James Barr. One of them, A Line in the Sand, the Anglo-French Struggle for the Middle East. And again, I think the big takeaway there, so many things, but the fact that the French actually armed and encouraged Zionist terrorism in the Middle East to help cause problems for their frenemy, Great Britain. And then the other book, Lords of the Desert, the battle between the United States and Great Britain for supremacy in the modern Middle East. And I think one of the most interesting things there is that Great Britain was part of the reason that the Zionist terrorists government in Israel got an atomic weapons program, while John F. Kennedy was trying to stop them from getting atomic weapons. Our allies, the French, and now from this book, the British, were helping them get atomic weapons. So you now know more than 99.99999999999% of the people that are on YouTube all day long talking like they know the full story of the Middle East. You could get these books, you could dive in, they're quite interesting. And they reveal, what do they reveal? That the mayhem there is, every area's got, crazy stuff going on, but the level of savagery and mayhem, surely there are episodes in human history this bad, but you'd be hard pressed to find anything worse, especially in Gaza, but now they're bringing it to Lebanon. The source of all this It's certainly not the Arabs. It's certainly not the Palestinians. It's a devil's bargain that first Britain and then France and now the United States has made with the Zionist terrorists in Palestine, because they think these parties, the French, first the English, then the French, then the Americans, think that somehow they're going to benefit from this. And if we go back to that quote by FDR, I mean, he lays it out pretty clear. If you want to, basically, he's saying if you want to take over the world, which is what these maniacs want to do, you got to control the Middle East. And so apparently the calculation of the psychos that run the United States government is something that FDR said about the ruler of uh, Nicaragua, about Somoza. He said he's a bastard or a son of a bitch, whatever he called him, but he's our son of a bitch. And that's pretty much what it boils down to in the view of the psychopaths that run the United States and Europe, England. Well, I shouldn't say all of Europe because some countries are coming around, but United States, Germany, France. Um, I guess the baked in hatred of Arab people is so strong that they would rather uh, uh, just turn the whole place upside down on behalf of a bunch of obvious criminals, because those criminals are people we can deal with, we can understand. They do things for us. Remember when the whole world had said to South Africa, what the hell are you doing? You can't treat people like this. Two countries were the last to say no. One of them was the United States, the other one was Israel, and Israel was providing them with arms and training and munitions and bombs, and I think even nuclear weapons. And believe it or not, I think Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, the neutral Swiss guy, his family made nuclear nuclear weapons technology for the Germans. I think that was one of his projects as a young man. Was a young man, but you're not allowed to talk about that. He helped bring nuclear technology with the help of the Israelis to South Africa. So South Africa has a bomb apparently. Anyway, it's a lot more complicated than they tell you. And there are books out there, and they're available amazingly. But they know, as what was it? Alan Dulles went after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and the big Warren Commission thing came out, which was massive, massive amount of. He said, "I'm not worried. Nobody reads." And so, on that note, read. I'd love to get James Barr on. He's not responding. Maybe he's not getting my emails. I don't know. But I would love, more importantly, for the good guys, and there are a lot of good guys out there who are doing good reporting on the Middle East, to talk to Barr and get the full picture of this history. It is a bunch of crazy psychopathic Zionist murderers carrying this out, but we're into it up to here. So I'm going to leave you on that note. And by the way, just a reminder, if you try to get to a YouTube video on Brass Check, and YouTube puts up some kind of barrier and wants you to sign in, or to save the planet or save the whales or reduce carbon, I don't know what their pretext is. Just hit the refresh button, and so far it seems every time I've done it, that window goes away. I think they're positioning to stop us from not just us, but all small publishers from being able to embed YouTube videos on our pages. I've been waiting 19 years for the shoe to drop, and it looks like they're going to drop it. So we'll get around them, but it's just like another hassle to deal with. I just got to remind you guys, like, not only do they hide the material from us, the basic information on the internet, right? Google has reshuffled the whole search engine. The Google search engine is garbage, right? The good stuff is now buried, or if it's not on the top page, or on the first 10 pages, they've essentially made it go away. So Google's done that. And then when you actually publish, when you actually find this information, which is now 50 times harder than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and then you publish it. Now you have a level of censorship that, there was always censorship, certainly of brass check stuff going back to at least 2008, but now it's crazed. So now not only do we have to, crawl through that barbed wire just to find the information, then we have to crawl through the barbed wire after we've synthesized it and put it up and put it out there. And now looks like YouTube's trying to try another little trick to stop letting us embed YouTube videos on our page, which we are kind of economically dependent on. Anyway, read, encourage the great. There are some great people out there doing great stuff on this subject, on the subject of Palestine and the Middle East. Encourage them to find James Barr and read his books and ask him some questions, because we cannot understand the Middle East unless we understand all the chicanery that's gone on before.
Brass Check TV, free to you, not free to us. We've got a server bill, we've got an email software bill, we've got a tech helper bill, and that happens every month. So to everybody that is supporting us financially, that's paying for their subscription in one way or another, we really appreciate it. If you're not, consider doing so. Everybody's got money for the newspaper and the cable bill and all that. Do you have money for media that's actually serving you? That's really the issue here. And when you help us, it allows us to get this information out to the world. So thanks to all our supporters, and if you're not a supporter already, please consider becoming one.